The Aegean world, long before the rise of classical Greece, was a region defined by its geography as much as by its people. A chain of peninsulas, islands, and narrow seas created a landscape that encouraged both separation and contact. The Aegean Sea, surrounded by the Greek mainland to the west, Anatolia to the east, and Crete to the south, served not as a barrier, but as a connector. The mountains of the mainland divided communities into small, independent valleys, while the coastlines provided natural harbors that invited exploration and trade. This environment shaped the early development of societies that would one day form the basis of the Greek world. Archaeological evidence from early settlements such as Sesklo and Demini in Thessaly reveals organized villages with planned streets, pottery industries, and trade connections reaching across the Aegean. These Neolithic communities, active as early as 6000 BCE, demonstrate that the idea of regional interaction and shared culture had already begun long before Greece as a political entity emerged. The geography of the Aegean also fostered a balance between isolation and communication. Because fertile plains were scarce, early inhabitants relied on mixed subsistence, farming where the soil allowed, herding in mountainous areas, and fishing along the coasts. Yet these same limitations encouraged ingenuity and movement. Over generations, people began to build small boats to cross narrow channels, transporting obsidian from the island of Melos, copper from Cyprus, and luxury goods from the eastern Mediterranean. This maritime interaction gradually transformed the Aegean into one of the first interconnected zones of prehistory. The sea acted as both a lifeline and a classroom, teaching navigation, trade, and diplomacy long before written records appeared. It was this constant exchange of goods and ideas that would later allow Minoan and Mycenaean cultures to thrive. Archaeologists have long recognized that geography determined not only how people lived, but also how they thought. In the Aegean, where mountains meet the sea, human communities developed a sense of autonomy. Each valley or island became a self-contained world with its own traditions, yet all remained part of a larger maritime network. This pattern would later influence the formation of the city-states, or polis, that characterized classical Greece. The preference for local governance, the reliance on the sea for contact rather than conquest, and the adaptability to limited natural resources were all inherited traits from these early landscapes. In a sense, geography provided Greece with both its challenges and its character. By 300 BCE, the island of Crete began to emerge as the most dynamic center of Aegean civilization. Its fertile plains and central position between Egypt, Anatolia, and the Greek mainland made it an ideal hub for trade and cultural diffusion. Excavations at Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea reveal palatial complexes with sophisticated architecture and administrative systems. These structures were not merely royal residences, but functioned as the economic and religious heart of the island's society. Walls were covered with frescoes depicting rituals, processions, and marine life, suggesting a culture both prosperous and deeply attuned to its environment. The presence of storage jars, known as pit hoi, and carefully planned storerooms indicates a redistributive economy. Goods from across the island were collected, recorded, and redistributed under central authority. The Minoans, as this civilization came to be known, left behind few written records that can be read today. Their script, linear A, remains undeciphered, but its frequent appearance on tablets and seals points to a complex administrative system. This suggests an early form of bureaucracy capable of managing large-scale trade networks that extended to the Nile Delta and the Levantine coast. Archaeological finds of Egyptian scarabs and Syrian ivory confirm these connections. The Minoans appear to have been skilled sailors who dominated the Aegean during the Middle Bronze Age. Unlike many contemporary civilizations, they built few fortifications, implying that their influence rested on commerce and diplomacy rather than conquest. One of the most revealing discoveries from Minoan Crete is the evidence of advanced urban planning. The palace at Knossos featured multi-story construction, light wells for ventilation, and plumbing systems with terracotta pipes, technological achievements unmatched elsewhere in Bronze Age Europe. Such innovations indicate a population not only wealthy, but also organized under stable governance capable of supporting specialized labor. Religion also played a central role. The numerous figurines of a female deity, often called the snake goddess, suggest reverence for fertility and nature. However, without decipherable texts, the exact nature of Minoan belief remains uncertain. What is clear is that their worldview placed harmony, artistry, and abundance at its core. The turning point came around 1450 BCE, when many Cretan sites were destroyed or abandoned. Scholars debate the cause: earthquakes, internal unrest, or the eruption of the Thera volcano on nearby Santorini, which devastated regional trade. In the aftermath, influence shifted northward to the Greek mainland, where a new power was rising. The Mycenaeans, who had long traded with Crete, adopted many elements of Minoan culture but reinterpreted them in a distinctly different manner. The Mycenaean civilization, named after the citadel of Mycenae in the Peloponnese, flourished between 1600 and 1100 BCE. Excavations reveal massive stone fortifications, monumental gates, and royal tombs filled with gold and weaponry. Unlike the Minoans, the Mycenaeans were warrior kings who combined trade with military power. Their script, Linear B, deciphered in the 1950s, provides the earliest known form of the Greek language and confirms the existence of bureaucratic administration similar to that of Crete. Tablets record inventories of oil, grain, metals, and textiles, demonstrating a society managed through centralized control. Mycenaean architecture reflects both power and anxiety. The citadels of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos were built on elevated ground and surrounded by walls of enormous limestone blocks known as Cyclopean masonry, a term inspired by later Greeks who believed only giants could have moved such stones. Inside these fortresses were megarons, or great halls, where rulers held audiences and performed rituals that blended political and religious authority. Artifacts from burial sites, such as the so-called Mask of Agamemnon and intricately decorated daggers, illustrate a culture that valued display and lineage. The Mycenaeans also established extensive contacts throughout the eastern Mediterranean, exporting pottery and metals while importing luxury goods from Egypt and Anatolia. Archaeological and textual evidence together suggest that Mycenaean Greece was organized as a network of palace-states, each ruled by a wanax, or king, supported by administrators and craftsmen. Their economy depended on agriculture, craft production, and seaborne trade. At its height, around the 13th century BCE, this system linked dozens of centers across the mainland and islands. However, this prosperity proved fragile. By 1200 BCE, the palaces fell one by one, and the Linear B script disappeared. The reasons for collapse remain debated: possible invasions, internal strife, economic strain, or natural disasters. Whatever the cause, the complex structure of Mycenaean society unraveled, leading to centuries of decline. The fall of Mycenaean civilization marked the end of the Aegean Bronze Age and the beginning of a period often called the Greek Dark Age. Yet, in retrospect, this collapse was not merely an end but a transformation. It dissolved the hierarchical palace systems, dispersing populations into smaller, more resilient communities. Oral traditions preserved fragments of memory that would later inspire the epics of Homer. The material and cultural foundations laid by the Minoans and Mycenaeans endured in architecture, art, and myth, providing a heritage upon which later Greek civilization would build. As the palaces fell silent, the Aegean world did not disappear. Villages persisted, farmers adapted, and seafarers continued to navigate the familiar coasts. Over the following centuries, these scattered communities redefined what it meant to be Greek. They would rediscover literacy, rebuild networks of trade, and create new forms of social organization. From the ruins of Mycenae arose a civilization that valued not royal command but civic participation. The patterns of geography, economy, and exchange that once shaped the Minoans and Mycenaeans would now guide the rebirth of Greece in a new form. This transition, from the great palaces of the Bronze Age to the humble settlements of the early Iron Age, marks the bridge to the next chapter in the Greek story, the Dark Age, a period of loss and renewal that would ultimately lead to the birth of the polis, the defining institution of the Greek world. When the Mycenaean palaces fell around 1200 BCE, the Aegean world entered what historians once called a Dark Age, a term that reflected the sudden absence of monumental architecture, literacy, and long-distance trade. Yet, as modern archaeology has shown, this period, spanning roughly from 1100 to 800 BCE, was not an era of complete darkness, but of quiet transformation. In the centuries that followed, the fragments of the old world reassembled into the foundations of a new one. The collapse of centralized kingdoms gave way to smaller, self-sufficient communities. Population declined, crafts diminished, and imported luxuries vanished, but human continuity persisted in the valleys, plains, and islands of Greece. In this more modest landscape, the seeds of future political and cultural innovation began to take root. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Lefkandi on the island of Euboea have reshaped our understanding of this era. There, evidence of substantial buildings, elaborate burials, and imported goods reveals that not all of Greece fell into desolation. The so-called Heroon of Lefkandi, a large structure possibly used for the burial of local elites, suggests that leadership, ritual, and external contacts continued, albeit on a smaller scale. Trade with Cyprus and the Near East, though reduced, never completely ceased. These remnants of connectivity helped preserve elements of craftsmanship, metallurgy, and navigation that would later facilitate Greece's recovery. The loss of writing during this time, specifically the disappearance of the linear B script, represented more than the decline of bureaucracy. It marked the end of the Bronze Age worldview dominated by palace economies and royal authority. Without centralized record-keeping, knowledge passed orally from generation to generation. Storytelling became the primary vessel of cultural memory. Through oral traditions, communities preserved tales of heroes, migrations, and gods, narratives that would eventually evolve into the Homeric epics. This shift from written administration to spoken legacy created a culture deeply rooted in memory, performance, and collective identity. Society during the Dark Age was organized into kinship-based groups known as oikoi, households that combined family, property, and labor into a single economic unit. Power became localized, centered around chieftains who commanded respect through personal ability rather than bureaucratic office. These leaders maintained order, organized defense, and managed resources. Over time, cooperation among neighboring households led to the emergence of early villages. The boundaries between these small communities were shaped by both geography and necessity, echoing the independent patterns that geography had always encouraged in the Aegean world. Material culture from the Dark Age reflects a simplicity born of adaptation rather than ignorance. Pottery styles, such as the proto-geometric ware, display careful precision and mathematical proportion, hinting at the disciplined aesthetic that would later characterize classical Greek art. Metalwork became rarer but more refined, emphasizing functionality over display. Agricultural tools show evidence of incremental innovation, including the use of iron, which gradually replaced bronze as the dominant metal. This transition to iron, though modest in appearance, was transformative. It democratized access to weapons and tools, reducing dependence on elite-controlled resources and allowing broader social participation in production and warfare. As the centuries passed, the Greek world began to stir again. Population growth, improved farming techniques, and the rediscovery of trade routes signaled recovery. By the 9th century BCE, communities expanded and began to cluster into larger settlements. Contact with Phoenician merchants reintroduced the Greeks to long-distance exchange and, more significantly, to a new writing system. Adapting the Phoenician alphabet, the Greeks created a phonetic script that was easier to learn and more flexible than Linear B. This innovation, appearing around 800 BCE, reconnected Greece to the written word and laid the groundwork for literature, law, and administration. The return of literacy coincided with a renewed sense of collective identity. The Homeric poems, though composed in this later period, preserved memories of the heroic age, blending myth and distant history into moral and cultural reference points. These epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, did more than recount wars and wanderings. They articulated values of honor, hospitality, courage, and fate. Through them, fragmented Greek communities found shared ideals. The oral performance of such poetry at festivals and gatherings fostered unity among scattered populations, subtly preparing the ground for the political cohesion that would follow. The transformation from village to polis, the city-state, was the defining outcome of the Dark Age. By the 8th century BCE, communities that had once been loose clusters of farms began to coalesce into organized settlements with shared temples, public spaces, and systems of governance. The polis was not merely a physical city. It was a collective organism combining territory, people, and law. Its emergence represented a social contract, cooperation among equals for mutual defense and prosperity. In many regions, old kinship bonds gave way to civic identities, and leadership evolved from hereditary chieftains to councils and assemblies. This transition marked the birth of political life in the Greek sense, governance as a shared civic duty rather than a royal privilege. The geographical diversity of Greece ensured that no single model of the polis prevailed. Some, like Sparta, retained strong aristocratic and militarized traditions, while others, like Athens, gradually experimented with broader participation. Yet, all shared the same foundation: autonomy, self-sufficiency, and communal identity. The landscape that had once fractured the Mycenaean kingdom into isolated strongholds now enabled the rise of numerous independent states. This fragmentation, paradoxically, became a source of creativity. Competition among polis spurred innovation in art, philosophy, and politics, ensuring that no single authority could suppress diversity of thought. Religion, too, evolved in new directions during this formative period. Local cults coalesced around shared pantheons of gods, integrating pre-Greek deities with influences from the Near East. Temples replaced household shrines, transforming religion from private observance to public institution. Sanctuaries such as Delphi and Olympia emerged as neutral spaces where rival city-states could gather, worship, and compete peacefully. These pan-Hellenic sites nurtured a sense of cultural unity that transcended political division. The Olympic Games, first recorded in 776 BCE, symbolized this newfound interconnectedness, a celebration of physical excellence and shared heritage that would continue for centuries. The recovery of Greece after the fall of the Mycenaeans was not sudden but cumulative, shaped by adaptation, persistence, and rediscovery. What began as scattered villages bound by kinship evolved into structured city-states bound by law and citizenship. The reintroduction of literacy, the rise of trade, and the codification of shared myths transformed a fragmented society into a cohesive civilization. By 800 BCE, Greece stood once more in communication with the wider world, ready to engage with the great powers of the Mediterranean. This period of renewal marks the transition from prehistory to history in the Greek world. The lessons of the Dark Age, self-reliance, adaptability, and community would form the ethical backbone of Greek civilization. Out of loss came reinvention, and from isolation arose cooperation. The polis, now firmly established, would become the defining feature of Hellenic life and the stage upon which democracy, philosophy, and art would soon emerge. As the 8th century dawned, Greece no longer looked inward. Ships once again crossed the Aegean and beyond, carrying settlers, goods, and ideas to distant shores. The age of colonization had begun, a movement that would spread Greek culture across the Mediterranean and shape the contours of the ancient world for centuries to come. Over the course of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Greece experienced an expansion that would transform both its physical landscape and its cultural horizons. What began as small, self-reliant communities grew outward, sending settlers across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. This age of colonization was not a sudden burst of empire building, but a gradual process born from necessity, the search for arable land, new trade routes, and social opportunity. The Greek homeland, mountainous and divided, could not sustain growing populations indefinitely. As agricultural output reached its limits, communities looked to the sea, guided by experience in navigation and an emerging spirit of enterprise. Archaeological and textual evidence reveal that these movements were systematic rather than chaotic. Expeditions often began with state sanction. A group of settlers, led by an appointed oikis or founder, would set sail to establish a new settlement. These colonies, known as apoikii, were politically independent from their mother cities but maintained religious and cultural ties. Their founding rituals, consultation of oracles, carrying of sacred fire from the homeland, illustrate the fusion of practicality and faith that defined Greek expansion. By the 7th century BCE, Greek colonies dotted coasts from Asia Minor to Italy and beyond, forming a maritime network that connected peoples, markets, and ideas. Among the earliest and most influential settlements were those in Ionia, on the western coast of Asia Minor. Here, proximity to the older civilizations of the Near East created fertile ground for intellectual and technological exchange. The Ionian Greeks adopted elements of Eastern art, metallurgy, and measurement systems, blending them into distinct forms that would later shape Hellenic identity. Cities like Miletus, Ephesus, and Smyrna became centers of trade and innovation. It was in Miletus that the first stirrings of scientific inquiry would later appear, an outcome of constant contact with Babylonian astronomy and Egyptian geometry. To the west, Greek settlers founded colonies in Sicily and southern Italy, regions that the Romans would later call Magna Graecia or Greater Greece. These cities, Syracuse, Tarentum, Croton, and others, thrived in fertile lands and along strategic coastal routes. They served as conduits for agricultural surplus, artistic development, and political experimentation. In Sicily, interaction with the Phoenicians and indigenous peoples fostered economic complexity and military rivalry, while in Italy, Greek settlers transmitted their alphabet and architectural techniques to the Etruscans, indirectly influencing the cultural foundations of Rome. The Mediterranean, once dominated by older civilizations, was now an interconnected sea of exchange in which Greek ideas circulated freely. This outward movement did not weaken the Greek homeland. Rather, it strengthened it. The colonies sent back grain, timber, metals, and luxury goods, fueling urban growth and diversification in the Aegean. Trade routes linked city-states into an economic web that encouraged cooperation and competition alike. The introduction of coinage in the 7th century BCE further accelerated commerce. Lydia, in Asia Minor, is often credited with issuing the first true coins, stamped lumps of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver. The Greeks rapidly adopted and refined the system, recognizing its potential to standardize transactions and strengthen civic economies. In cities like Aegina and Corinth, coinage became not only a tool of trade but a symbol of sovereignty and identity. This era also witnessed significant social change within the Greek city-states. The expansion of commerce and craftsmanship produced new classes of citizens whose wealth no longer depended solely on land. The old aristocratic order, based on hereditary privilege, began to face pressure from merchants, artisans, and small farmers seeking representation and fairness. Conflicts between elite families and common citizens became recurring themes in the political life of many polis. In response, reformers emerged, men who sought to balance justice with stability through written laws and restructured institutions. In Athens, these pressures would eventually give rise to democracy, but its roots lay in earlier experiments elsewhere. In the city of Drairos on Crete, one of the earliest recorded laws was inscribed on stone, setting limits on the powers of magistrates. In Corinth and Megara, shifts in leadership produced mixed systems of governance where oligarchies and councils shared authority. The codification of law marked a decisive step in Greek political evolution. It placed justice in the public sphere, accessible to all literate citizens, and curbed the arbitrary rule of nobles. The very act of writing law symbolized the triumph of reason over custom, a foundational principle of Greek civilization. Religious life evolved alongside political and economic change. The growth of pan-Hellenic sanctuaries such as Delphi, Olympia, and Delos reflected the expanding sense of shared Greek identity. Pilgrims and envoys from distant city-states gathered to consult oracles, offer sacrifices, and celebrate festivals. These gatherings, particularly the Olympic Games, strengthened cultural unity even as political rivalries deepened. Temples grew in scale and sophistication, built with columns and symmetry that embodied order and proportion. The architectural forms developed during this period, Doric, Ionic, and later Corinthian, would become enduring symbols of balance and rational design. Contact with foreign peoples also reshaped Greek art and technology. From the East came motifs of lions, sphinxes, and rosettes, adapted into the Greek geometric and orientalizing styles. Pottery from this time shows experimentation with narrative scenes, depictions of myth, warfare, and daily life that suggest growing confidence in visual storytelling. The black figure technique, developed in Corinth around 700 BCE, allowed artists to portray detailed human figures, while advances in metallurgy led to the creation of life-sized bronze statues. These artistic innovations mirrored the intellectual ferment of the age, a desire to represent the world with precision and order. As trade expanded, so too did literacy. The spread of the Greek alphabet facilitated record-keeping, correspondence, and the preservation of oral poetry. Writing transitioned from sacred or administrative use to a medium for reflection and public discourse. The earliest known inscriptions, such as the Cup of Nestor from Pithecusae, combine humor with literary awareness, suggesting that writing had already entered social life as a mark of identity and intellect. The alphabet, accessible and adaptable, democratized knowledge in ways the old scripts never had. It allowed history, law, and poetry to become collective inheritance rather than elite privilege. By the close of the 7th century BCE, the outlines of classical Greece were clearly visible. City-states had matured into complex political entities, each pursuing distinct paths of governance. Economic networks spanned continents, uniting the Aegean with Egypt, Phoenicia, and the Western Mediterranean. Artistic expression had achieved coherence, guided by symmetry and human form. And across this world, a shared language and religion provided continuity. The Greek world had evolved from isolation to integration, from subsistence to sophistication. The era of colonization thus represented more than geographic expansion. It was the formative stage of Greek civilization's identity as outward-looking, inventive, and self-reflective. The Greeks did not merely build settlements. They built systems of interaction between cultures, economies, and ideas. These connections laid the intellectual and material foundations for the next great transformation, the political and philosophical flowering of the classical age. As the 6th century approached, prosperity and contact had made the Greek world more interconnected than ever, but also more volatile. Social inequalities deepened, and rival city-states began to vie for dominance. In this tension between freedom and control, between unity and independence, the next chapter of the Hellenic story would unfold: the birth of democracy, the clash of empires, and the enduring quest to define the nature of human order. By the beginning of the 6th century BCE, the Greek world had reached a moment of profound internal transformation. The long centuries of recovery and expansion had given rise to a new kind of community, independent, self-governing, and economically dynamic. Yet prosperity brought conflict, and freedom brought complexity. Within the growing city-states, questions of power, justice, and social balance began to dominate political life. The polis, once a cooperative association of equals, became a battleground of competing interests. Landowners, merchants, craftsmen, and farmers each sought representation in a system that had not yet learned to accommodate them all. Out of this tension emerged the first great experiments in law, governance, and civic philosophy that would define the political culture of Greece for centuries. The 6th century opened with a struggle between tradition and reform. Aristocratic families, claiming descent from heroic ancestors, had long monopolized authority through councils and magistracies. Their power rested on lineage, wealth, and control of land. However, as trade expanded and new classes of citizens acquired wealth through commerce rather than inheritance, the old order began to falter. The widening gap between privilege and poverty produced recurring crises. In some city-states, such unrest led to the rise of tyrants, leaders who seized power with popular support, often promising justice and economic relief. The term tyrant in this early context did not yet imply cruelty. Rather, it denoted a ruler who broke aristocratic monopolies and ruled outside hereditary law. In Corinth, Cypselus and later his son Periander exemplified the early tyrant's role as both reformer and consolidator. Their rule stabilized trade and expanded maritime power, transforming Corinth into one of the wealthiest cities of the Greek world. Similar figures appeared elsewhere: Polycrates in Samos, Pittacus in Mytilene, and Pisistratus in Athens. Pisistratus, though often remembered as an autocrat, governed with a remarkable balance of authority and vision. He maintained the existing laws of Solon, promoted agriculture, and fostered cultural expression. Under his guidance, Athens became a center of artistic production, and the Panathenaic Festival, a celebration of civic identity, was reorganized into a grand event that unified the population. The reforms of Solon, enacted a generation earlier around 594 BCE, marked one of the most significant turning points in Athenian history. Appointed archon at a time of severe economic distress, Solon sought to restore stability without destroying the social fabric. His measures, collectively known as the Sysaxia, or shaking off of burdens, abolished debt slavery and restructured the political system to reflect wealth rather than birth. Citizens were divided into 4 property classes, each granted proportional rights and responsibilities. This system did not create equality, but it introduced flexibility, a mechanism by which merit and contribution could influence status. Solon's introduction of legal appeal to public courts and his insistence that citizens participate in governance laid the groundwork for the democratic reforms that would follow a century later. Across the Greek world, similar efforts to codify and rationalize governance appeared. In Sparta, the reforms attributed to the lawgiver Lycurgus established a unique social and military order that stood apart from the rest of Greece. Sparta's constitution, a blend of monarchy, oligarchy, and limited democracy, aimed to preserve stability through discipline and communal loyalty. 2 kings ruled jointly, advised by a council of elders known as the Gerousia, and checked by an assembly of citizens. Every male Spartan underwent rigorous education and military training, ensuring that the city remained perpetually prepared for war. The Spartan system prioritized the collective over the individual, creating a society of soldiers bound by obedience and equality among themselves, though sustained by the labor of the subjugated Helot population. The contrast between Sparta and Athens came to define much of Greek political discourse. While Sparta embodied order through uniformity, Athens moved toward freedom through participation. The tension between these models, discipline versus deliberation, would shape the destiny of Greece during its classical age. Yet in this early period, both cities shared a commitment to the polis as the highest form of human organization. The idea that governance should be rooted in law rather than personal power became a shared principle, uniting diverse systems under a common intellectual foundation. The 6th century also witnessed remarkable cultural and artistic maturation. Temples grew in grandeur, reflecting both civic pride and devotion to the gods. At Delphi, the sanctuary of Apollo became a pan-Hellenic center of consultation and prophecy. City-states sent lavish offerings, building treasuries along the sacred way as symbols of wealth and prestige. The oracle's ambiguous pronouncements influenced decisions of war, colonization, and reform, binding the Greek world through shared belief and ritual. At Olympia, the Olympic Games continued to reinforce a sense of kinship among rival cities, demonstrating the paradox of Greek identity, fierce independence within an enduring cultural unity. In art, the Archaic period brought the emergence of naturalism and human proportion. The kouros and kore statues, idealized figures of young men and women, embodied the Greek pursuit of form and balance. Though rigid in stance, their subtle expressions and anatomical precision reflected growing interest in the study of human nature. Architecture followed a similar trajectory, with the Doric and Ionic orders achieving their mature forms. The Temple of Hera at Olympia, the early Parthenon on the Acropolis, and the great sanctuaries of Paestum and Samos all testified to a civilization learning to translate order into stone. Intellectual curiosity expanded alongside artistic expression. The Ionian cities, especially Miletus, became the birthplace of natural philosophy. Thinkers such as Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes sought to explain the universe not through myth, but through reason. Thales proposed that all things derived from water, not as a poetic metaphor, but as a hypothesis grounded in observation. Anaximander introduced the idea of the apeiron, the boundless origin of all things, while Anaximenes argued for air as the fundamental substance. These early cosmologies marked the beginning of scientific thought, an effort to understand natural processes through principles rather than divine will. In parallel, poets and thinkers explored the moral and social dimensions of human life. The elegies of Solon and Theognis reflected anxiety over justice and change. The verses of Sappho celebrated personal emotion and social refinement. Herodotus would later look back on this age as the time when Greece began to define its character through reflection, debate, and art. The shift from collective myth to individual reason, from divine explanation to human inquiry, was underway. The economic landscape of Greece continued to evolve, sustained by maritime trade and craftsmanship. Athens, Corinth, and Chalcis became centers of pottery and metalwork, their exports reaching distant markets. The spread of coinage standardized commerce, while advances in shipbuilding improved navigation and speed. Greek merchants traveled as far as Egypt and the Levant, absorbing foreign knowledge in mathematics, astronomy, and measurement. This exchange of goods and ideas nourished both intellectual growth and political awareness. Exposure to the institutions of Egypt and the empires of the Near East sharpened Greek appreciation for the contrast between autocracy and civic freedom. By the late 6th century BCE, Athens had emerged as a dynamic polis ready for transformation. The tyranny of Pisistratus had brought stability and cultural advancement, but after his death, the succession of his sons, Hippias and Hipparchus, led to internal unrest. The assassination of Hipparchus and the growing resentment of Hippias's rule opened the path for political reorganization. In 508 BCE, Cleisthenes introduced reforms that restructured the Athenian state into new tribes based on residence rather than kinship. This system dissolved the power of aristocratic families and empowered citizens to participate directly in decision-making. The Athenian assembly became the voice of the people, setting the precedent for democratic governance that would reach its height in the next century. Thus, through conflict, reform, and experimentation, the Greeks had forged the essential instruments of civic life: written law, shared governance, and public accountability. The polis was no longer a mere settlement. It had become an arena for human reason, debate, and self-determination. The cultural energy unleashed during this age, artistic, intellectual, and political, prepared Greece for the challenges ahead. As the 5th century approached, the Greek world stood on the threshold of confrontation with a vast external power, the Persian Empire. The wars that followed would test the endurance of the polis, unify its people under common cause, and define the classical spirit of freedom that would echo through history. By the dawn of the 5th century BCE, the Greek world had matured into a constellation of independent city-states, each governed by its own laws, traditions, and ambitions. This diversity was both its strength and its vulnerability. While the Greeks shared a common language, religion, and cultural heritage, they lacked political unity. Beyond the Aegean, a far greater power had risen: the Persian Empire, stretching from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Mediterranean. Under Kings Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius, and Xerxes, Persia had forged the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, ruling through a sophisticated system of administration and tolerance. Yet, for all its reach, Persia could not ignore the defiant independence of the small, fractious communities along the western coast of Asia Minor, the Ionian Greeks. The Ionian Revolt of 499 BC marked the first collision between the two worlds. The Ionian cities, led by Miletus, rebelled against Persian rule, seeking assistance from their kin across the Aegean. Athens and Eretria sent ships and men, not fully understanding the scale of the power they were about to challenge. The revolt failed, and Miletus was destroyed, but the Persian king Darius I took note of the mainland Greeks who had dared to interfere. His ambition shifted from pacification to punishment. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define the future of Greece. In 490 BCE, a Persian expeditionary force landed on the plains of Marathon, northeast of Athens. Facing them stood a vastly smaller Athenian army, joined by a contingent from Plataea. The Greeks, fighting as hoplites, heavily armed infantrymen in close formation, relied not on numbers but on discipline and unity. The battle that followed was brief but decisive. The Persians were routed, and their fleet withdrew. Marathon became a symbol of what free citizens could achieve through collective courage. The victory, however, did not end the Persian threat. It only postponed a reckoning. A decade later, under Darius's successor Xerxes I, Persia returned with overwhelming force. Ancient accounts describe a vast invasion, hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of troops, crossing the Hellespont on floating bridges and marching through Thrace into Greece. For once, the usually divided Greek city-states recognized the necessity of cooperation. Under the leadership of Sparta, a coalition was formed, representing a rare unity in the face of annihilation. The Persians advanced southward, meeting resistance at the narrow pass of Thermopylae. There, in 480 BCE, King Leonidas and his small Spartan-led force held the line for 3 days against impossible odds, allowing Greek forces elsewhere to prepare. Though the defenders were ultimately overwhelmed, their stand became a defining moment of Greek resolve and sacrifice. As the Persian army pressed toward Athens, the city's citizens evacuated to the island of Salamis. There, Themistocles, an Athenian statesman and strategist, devised a plan that would change the course of history. Luring the Persian navy into the narrow straits between Salamis and the mainland, he forced their larger ships into disarray. The Greek triremes, smaller, faster, and expertly maneuvered, struck with precision. The Persian fleet was shattered, and Xerxes withdrew to Asia, leaving part of his army behind. The following year, in 479 BCE, the Greeks delivered a final blow at Plataea, defeating the remaining Persian forces and securing their independence. The Persian wars had done more than repel invasion. They had transformed Greek consciousness. The sense of shared purpose forged in battle gave new meaning to the idea of Hellas, Greece as a cultural and political identity that transcended the polis. The triumph over a vast empire reinforced faith in freedom, civic participation, and the value of reasoned debate over obedience. Yet, this victory also planted the seeds of future rivalry. Athens and Sparta, the two chief architects of the resistance, emerged as competing powers with incompatible visions of order. In the aftermath of the war, Athens took the lead in organizing a defensive alliance against future Persian aggression. Known as the Delian League, it was established in 478 BCE, with its treasury originally located on the sacred island of Delos. Member city-states contributed ships or funds in exchange for mutual protection. Over time, however, Athens transformed this league into an instrument of its own empire. Tribute from member states financed massive construction projects, most famously the rebuilding of the Acropolis and the Parthenon under Pericles. The city became the cultural and intellectual heart of Greece, a beacon of democracy, art, and philosophy. Under Pericles' leadership in the mid-5th century, Athens reached its zenith. The city's political system, refined from the reforms of Cleisthenes, rested on the principle of isonomia, equality before the law. The assembly, composed of male citizens, debated and decided all major policies, while the Council of 500 managed daily governance. Public service was regarded as a duty, and participation was both a right and an obligation. This model of direct democracy, though limited in scope, excluding women, slaves, and foreigners, represented an unprecedented experiment in collective self-rule. The arts flourished in this environment of civic confidence. Tragedy and comedy became instruments of public reflection. Sculptors and architects sought perfection in form and proportion. Philosophers questioned the nature of virtue, justice, and knowledge. The intellectual flowering of Athens during this era remains one of history's most remarkable achievements. Dramatists like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides explored the human condition through myth and morality, transforming ritual into literature. Herodotus, often called the father of history, sought to record human events not as divine will, but as the consequence of cause and choice. The sculptor Phidias captured divine idealism in marble and bronze, while architects such as Echinus and Callicrates designed temples that embodied mathematical harmony. Together, these achievements reflected a civilization confident in its capacity to shape the world through intellect and creativity. Yet, beneath this brilliance lay tension. The same democratic ideals that fostered innovation also produced instability and ambition. Athens' dominance over its allies bred resentment. As the Delian League's funds were used to beautify Athens rather than protect all members equally, other city-states began to see the League as an empire in disguise. Sparta, leading the Peloponnesian League, positioned itself as defender of autonomy against Athenian imperialism. The unity that had once saved Greece from Persia began to fracture under the weight of rivalry. The growing polarization between Athens and Sparta was not merely political, but ideological. Sparta's rigid discipline and collective ethos clashed with Athens' openness and intellectual dynamism. The two cities embodied opposing models of human society, one built on obedience and order, the other on debate and innovation. Their competition extended into every sphere: military power, trade dominance, and moral prestige. When minor disputes among allies escalated into open conflict in 431 BCE, the stage was set for the Peloponnesian War, a struggle that would engulf the entire Greek world. The Persian Wars had demonstrated what Greece could achieve when united. The coming century would reveal the cost of division. The age that had begun in triumph would descend into exhaustion. Yet, even amid war, the legacy of freedom, inquiry, and civic life born from the struggle against Persia would endure. The Greeks had defined themselves through resistance, not merely against empire, but against the notion that human destiny was fixed by power alone. In the next chapter of their history, that conviction would be tested to its limits. The Peloponnesian War, beginning in 431 BCE, marked the collapse of the fragile balance that had defined the Greek world since the defeat of Persia. What began as a contest between Athens and Sparta quickly consumed nearly every major city-state in the Aegean and beyond. The conflict lasted nearly 3 decades, divided into shifting alliances, temporary truces, and bitter betrayals. It was a war not only of arms, but of ideology, between democracy and oligarchy, between maritime power and land strength, between two incompatible visions of how the Greek world should be governed. Thucydides, the Athenian historian and general who chronicled the conflict, described it as a tragedy of human ambition and fear. He noted that the true cause of the war lay not in isolated disputes, but in the growing power of Athens, which threatened the security of Sparta and its allies. The city that had once led Greece in the name of freedom now ruled through tribute and coercion. Its empire stretched across the Aegean, supported by its navy and wealth from trade. Sparta, though more conservative, saw this dominance as intolerable. Both sides entered the war convinced of their righteousness, unable to foresee the ruin it would bring. The war's early years were dominated by contrasting strategies. Athens, under Pericles, avoided direct land battles with the superior Spartan army. Instead, it relied on its walls, fleet, and access to the sea for supplies. Sparta ravaged the Athenian countryside, but the city remained secure behind its fortifications. The stalemate was broken not by battle, but by disease. In 430 BCE, a devastating plague swept through Athens, claiming tens of thousands of lives, including Pericles himself. The historian Thucydides, who survived the illness, recorded the chaos and despair that followed: social order collapsing, faith eroding, and law giving way to desperation. The plague weakened Athens morally and demographically. leaving the city vulnerable to the unpredictable politics that followed. Despite these setbacks, Athens endured. Under the leadership of figures like Cleon and later Alcibiades, the city attempted to regain momentum through bold offensives. The war entered its second phase, a period of shifting alliances and temporary peace. The Peace of Nicias, signed in 421 BCE, was intended to last 50 years but barely survived 6. Mutual suspicion and ambition undermined the truce. Athens soon embarked on one of the most ambitious military expeditions of the era, the invasion of Sicily in 415 BCE. The Sicilian expedition was conceived as a means to expand Athenian influence and secure new resources, but it proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The campaign was led initially by Alcibiades, a charismatic yet controversial figure whose ambitions often clashed with Athenian moderation. Accused of sacrilege before departure, he defected to Sparta, offering his former enemies critical advice. Deprived of clear leadership and plagued by logistical failures, the Athenian forces found themselves trapped in a hostile land. The expedition ended in disaster in 413 BCE, the fleet destroyed, the army annihilated, and thousands of soldiers enslaved or killed. It was a turning point, not just a military defeat but a moral collapse. After Sicily, Athens was weakened but not yet destroyed. The Persians, seeking to exploit Greek divisions, began funding Sparta's naval forces, providing the means to challenge Athenian supremacy at sea. Internal strife within Athens deepened as oligarchic factions attempted to seize control, briefly overthrowing the democracy in 411 BCE. Though the democratic government was restored, the city's stability had been irrevocably shaken. By the final phase of the war, the balance of power had shifted decisively. Under the Spartan admiral Lysander, and with Persian financial support, Sparta achieved a series of decisive victories. In 405 BCE, at the Battle of Aegospotami, the Athenian fleet, the foundation of its empire, was destroyed. Cut off from supplies, besieged, and starving, Athens surrendered the following year. The long walls were torn down, its navy dismantled, and an oligarchic regime known as the 30 Tyrants was installed under Spartan supervision. For the first time in living memory, Athens was no longer free. The once vibrant democracy that had defined the classical age lay in ruins. Yet, even in defeat, Athens retained a cultural and intellectual vitality unmatched in the ancient world. Within a few years, the democratic system was restored and public life resumed. But the era of Athenian dominance was over. Sparta, now the leading power in Greece, sought to impose its hegemony across the city-states. However, its rigid system, designed for discipline rather than administration, proved ill-suited to empire. Within decades, discontent grew among its allies, and new powers emerged to challenge it. The Thebans, under the leadership of Epaminondas, dealt Sparta a crushing blow at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, ending its supremacy once and for all. The long century of war had changed Greece beyond recognition. The ideal of unity that had inspired the resistance against Persia was gone, replaced by cycles of rivalry and retribution. The economic and demographic toll was immense. Farmlands lay abandoned, populations displaced, and trade disrupted. Many citizens, disillusioned by the failures of democracy and oligarchy alike, turned inward, seeking stability through philosophy rather than politics. It was in this environment that new schools of thought flourished, from Socrates' examination of ethics and knowledge to Plato's search for ideal governance and Aristotle's systematic exploration of science and logic. Philosophy, once a peripheral pursuit, became a means to understand the failures of the polis and the nature of human behavior itself. Socrates, condemned by Athens in 399 BCE for impiety and corruption of youth, became a symbol of the tension between individual conscience and collective authority. His pupil Plato founded the Academy, envisioning a republic ruled by reason rather than persuasion. Aristotle, in turn, grounded philosophy in observation and analysis, laying the foundations for future scientific inquiry. These thinkers transformed the intellectual landscape, ensuring that Greece's true legacy would outlast its political decline. Meanwhile, The balance of power among the Greek city-states continued to shift. Thebes briefly dominated, but internal divisions prevented any lasting unity. Across the northern frontier, however, a new force was rising, the Kingdom of Macedon. Under King Philip II, Macedon adopted and adapted the military techniques of the southern Greeks, combining disciplined infantry with effective cavalry. He understood what the Greeks themselves could not, that unity was achievable only under centralized leadership. By the mid-4th century BCE, Philip began intervening in Greek affairs, presenting himself as the protector of Greek freedom while gradually bringing the city-states under his influence. His victory at the Battle of Corinea in 338 BC marked the end of Greek independence in its classical form. Yet, paradoxically, it also opened the door to the next great chapter in Greek history, one that would carry its culture far beyond the Aegean. Philip's son, Alexander, would inherit not only his father's throne but also his vision. The Peloponnesian War had destroyed the old order but had not extinguished the Greek spirit. From the ruins of Athens and the decline of Sparta would emerge a new synthesis of power and intellect, one that would transform the Greek world into a global civilization. As the classical era closed, the Hellenic spirit prepared to take a new form, expansive, syncretic, and enduring. The next chapter would begin in Macedon, where a young conqueror would turn Greece's inward struggles into outward conquest. When Philip II of Macedon ascended to the throne in 359 BCE, Greece was a fractured land, exhausted by generations of warfare. The great city-states, Athens, Sparta, and Thebes, had lost their dominance, their populations depleted, and their alliances unstable. The balance of power that had once defined the Aegean world no longer existed. Into this vacuum stepped Macedon, a kingdom once considered peripheral and uncivilized by the southern Greeks. Yet under Philip's leadership, it would rise from the margins to unify the Greek world under a single political and military system. Philip's ascent was marked by both internal consolidation and external ambition. At the time of his coronation, Macedon faced threats on multiple fronts: Illyrians to the west, Thracians to the east, and internal noble factions vying for control. Through a combination of diplomacy, strategic marriage alliances, and disciplined reform, Philip transformed the kingdom into a formidable state. He reorganized the army, introducing the Macedonian phalanx, a formation of long spear infantry supported by mobile cavalry. Its innovation lay in its coordination. The sarissa, a spear twice the length of traditional Greek weaponry, gave Macedon an unparalleled reach in battle. Complemented by strong logistics and professional soldiers, this system turned Macedon into the most efficient fighting force in the Greek world. Philip's ambitions, however, extended beyond securing his borders. He understood that the disunity of Greece offered opportunity. The southern city-states, still clinging to autonomy, were unable to form a common front. Through a mixture of persuasion and pressure, Philip positioned himself as both liberator and arbiter. He intervened in disputes among the Greek states, presenting his actions as efforts to restore order. His influence expanded rapidly after his decisive victory at the Battle of Corinea in 338 BCE, where the combined forces of Athens and Thebes were defeated. The young Alexander, then only 18, commanded the Macedonian left flank, a moment that marked his emergence as a leader in his own right. Following Corinea, Philip established the League of Corinth, a federation of Greek states united under Macedonian leadership. While the League nominally preserved the autonomy of its members, in practice it signified the end of independent Greek politics. Philip declared his intention to lead a pan-Hellenic campaign against Persia, an endeavor framed as vengeance for the invasions of the previous century, but also as an opportunity for expansion. This vision, though imperial in nature, appealed to the Greeks' shared sense of destiny and cultural superiority. For the first time, Greece stood nominally united, not by voluntary alliance, but by conquest. Philip's reign, however, was cut short. In 336 BCE, on the eve of his planned Persian campaign, he was assassinated during a public festival at Aegae. The motives remain uncertain: political intrigue, personal revenge, or the result of court rivalries, but his death created immediate instability. Many assumed that Macedon, like so many Greek states before it, would fracture in the absence of its strong ruler. Instead, it was Philip's 20-year-old son, Alexander, who seized the throne and proved capable not only of maintaining his father's empire, but of expanding it beyond all precedent. Alexander III of Macedon, later known as Alexander the Great, inherited both a powerful army and an ambitious mission. Trained by Aristotle, he combined military skill with intellectual curiosity, embodying the fusion of Greek culture and Macedonian discipline. His early reign was marked by swift and decisive action. When several Greek cities rebelled upon his accession, Alexander moved rapidly to assert control. The destruction of Thebes in 335 BCE, complete and uncompromising, sent a clear message to the rest of Greece. The era of defiance was over. With the homeland secured, he turned his attention eastward, to the Persian Empire. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with approximately 40,000 men, initiating one of the most extraordinary campaigns in history. His first major engagement, the Battle of the Granicus River, demonstrated his tactical brilliance and personal courage. The Persian satraps were defeated, and Asia Minor fell under his control. Over the next 3 years, Alexander dismantled the Persian military system piece by piece. His victories at Issus in 333 BCE and Gaugamela in 331 BCE were decisive, the latter effectively ending the reign of Darius III and sealing the fate of the Achaemenid Empire. The Macedonian phalanx and companion cavalry operated with precision, while Alexander's ability to adapt to different terrains and strategies ensured his continual success. But Alexander's conquest was more than military. Wherever he advanced, he established cities, over 20 in total, often bearing his name. These Alexandrias became centers of administration, trade, and culture, designed to spread Greek language and institutions across the conquered lands. His policy of fusion between Greek and Eastern customs was deliberate. He encouraged marriages between his soldiers and local women, adopted elements of Persian dress and ceremony, and incorporated non-Greek elites into his administration. Though controversial among his own men, this approach laid the groundwork for a new cultural synthesis, the Hellenistic world. As Alexander advanced deeper into Asia, his ambition grew. From Egypt to Mesopotamia, from the Persian heartlands to the mountains of Bactria, he sought not merely to conquer, but to create a new order. In Egypt, he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule and was proclaimed pharaoh. There, he founded the city of Alexandria, destined to become one of the greatest centers of learning in antiquity. His march continued eastward through the Persian plateau and into Central Asia, where he faced fierce resistance. The campaigns in Bactria and Sogdiana tested his army's endurance and loyalty. Yet even in these remote regions, Alexander's strategic ingenuity prevailed. By 327 BCE, his attention turned toward India, the eastern limit of the known world. Crossing the Hindu Kush, he faced the formidable forces of King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes River. Despite the elephants and the unfamiliar terrain, Alexander's forces triumphed once again. His treatment of Porus afterward, restoring him as a regional ruler, reflected a pattern of pragmatism mixed with respect for local authority. But his army, exhausted and longing for home, refused to march further east. Reluctantly, Alexander turned back, journeying down the Indus River and then westward across the harsh deserts of Gidroja. The march proved deadly. Thousands perished, but the empire remained intact. Upon his return to Babylon in 323 BCE, Alexander began planning new campaigns, perhaps into Arabia or beyond. Yet at the height of his power, he fell ill and died at the age of 32. The cause remains debated: fever, poison, or exhaustion, but the consequence was clear. The empire he had forged collapsed almost immediately into rival factions. His generals, the Diadochi, divided the territories among themselves, giving rise to new kingdoms: the Seleucid Empire in Asia, the Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt, and the Antigonid realm in Macedon and Greece. Though politically fragmented, The world Alexander created endured culturally and intellectually for centuries. The Hellenistic age that followed was one of profound transformation. Greek language, art, and philosophy blended with Eastern traditions, forming a cosmopolitan civilization that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus. Alexandria, Antioch, and Pergamon became centers of learning and innovation, housing libraries, observatories, and schools of philosophy. Science and mathematics flourished under figures such as Euclid, Archimedes, and Eratosthenes. The Stoic and Epicurean schools emerged, reflecting a new search for personal meaning in an increasingly vast and complex world. Though Alexander's empire had crumbled politically, its cultural foundations endured. The idea of a connected, rational world governed by shared knowledge and civic ideals, the essence of Hellenism, became the enduring legacy of Greece. In this new world, the Greek polis gave way to the cosmopolis, the notion that humanity itself could be bound by reason rather than geography. In the next chapter, the Hellenistic legacy will continue to unfold, a period where the achievements of art, science, and philosophy reached their height, even as political power shifted toward Rome. The world that Alexander left behind was no longer merely Greek. It was global, and its influence would shape the course of civilization for millennia to come. The death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC marked not merely the end of a conqueror's life, but the fragmentation of a vast experiment, the attempt to merge East and West into a single political and cultural world. What followed was not the restoration of older orders, but the birth of a new era, the Hellenistic Age. This was an age of transition, stretching from the late 4th century to the mid-1st century BCE, during which Greek culture spread across the eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, and deep into Asia. The world that emerged was cosmopolitan, dynamic, and profoundly interconnected. It was no longer the Greece of independent polis, but a network of great kingdoms and cities, bound by trade, scholarship, and a shared intellectual language. In the immediate aftermath of Alexander's death, the question of succession divided his empire. He had left no adult heir, only an unborn child by his wife Roxana and a half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus, who was mentally unfit to rule. Into this vacuum stepped his generals, the Diadochi, each determined to claim part of his legacy. Initially, they attempted a joint regency, but the arrangement collapsed into decades of warfare. The Wars of the Successors, 322 to 275 BCE, reshaped the political map of the ancient world. Ptolemy seized Egypt, establishing the Ptolemaic dynasty with its capital at Alexandria. Seleucus claimed the vast eastern territories, founding the Seleucid Empire stretching from Anatolia to the borders of India. Antigonus and his descendants held Macedon and much of Greece. Lysimachus and Cassander controlled smaller regions of Asia Minor and the Balkans. Though these kingdoms were ruled by Macedonian dynasties, they absorbed and transformed the cultures of the regions they governed. Local traditions continued, but Greek became the language of administration, scholarship, and urban life. Among these successor states, Egypt under the Ptolemies stood out as the most stable and enduring. Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's closest companions, combined military discipline with pragmatic governance. He preserved Egyptian religious institutions while introducing Greek administration, allowing both cultures to coexist. Alexandria, founded by Alexander and developed under Ptolemaic rule, became the intellectual capital of the Hellenistic world. Its harbor bustled with merchants from across the Mediterranean, and its towering Pharos lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, symbolized the city's role as a beacon of knowledge and commerce. The centerpiece of Alexandria's greatness was its library and museum, an institution unlike anything seen before. Scholars gathered from every corner of the known world to collect, translate, and study the accumulated wisdom of humanity. The library's collection, said to number hundreds of thousands of scrolls, preserved and systematized works in science, philosophy, mathematics, and literature. It was here that Euclid formalized geometry, that Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, and that scholars like Herophilus advanced anatomical understanding through dissection. Knowledge became an international pursuit, transcending the boundaries of nation or ethnicity. Elsewhere, the Seleucid Empire functioned as a bridge between East and West. Centered at Antioch and later at Seleucia on the Tigris, it governed a diverse population of Greeks, Persians, Babylonians, and others. This diversity produced both creativity and instability. The empire's vastness made it difficult to control, leading to frequent rebellions and secessions. Yet its urban centers thrived as hubs of exchange, where Greek theaters stood beside Eastern temples and philosophical schools operated alongside priestly academies. Greek artistic styles blended with Mesopotamian motifs, creating a hybrid aesthetic that influenced art for centuries. In Greece itself, the old city-states continued to exist, but in diminished form. Athens remained a center of philosophy and learning, home to the academy and the lyceum. However, political independence was largely gone, replaced by shifting alliances among the Hellenistic kings. Sparta, too, faded into obscurity, its rigid traditions ill-suited to a changing world. New leagues, such as the Aetolian and Achaean confederations, attempted to revive the spirit of collective autonomy, but their influence remained limited compared to the great monarchies of the East. Hellenistic art and architecture reflected this transformation. The classical ideals of balance and restraint gave way to emotional expression, movement, and realism. The sculptures of this era, such as the Laocoon group and the Winged Victory of Samothrace, conveyed human suffering and triumph with dramatic intensity. Architecture expanded in scale, with vast sanctuaries, theaters, and colonnaded streets designed for royal display rather than civic assembly. The individual replaced the collective as the primary subject of art, mirroring the broader shift from the polis to the cosmopolitan world. Religion, too, adapted to new realities. The traditional Greek pantheon endured, but new cults emerged, emphasizing personal salvation and divine kingship. The ruler was often portrayed as a god or the chosen intermediary between humans and the divine, a concept borrowed from Eastern traditions and integrated into Hellenistic governance. Mystery religions, such as the cults of Isis and Serapis, promised personal immortality and emotional connection, appealing to populations disoriented by the loss of old civic identities. Philosophy responded to the uncertainties of this new age. The great systems of the classical period, Plato's idealism and Aristotle's empiricism, gave way to schools focused on ethics and personal well-being. Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium, taught that virtue lay in accepting fate with rational composure and aligning one's will with nature's order. Epicureanism, developed by Epicurus, advocated the pursuit of simple pleasures and the avoidance of pain, rejecting superstition and fear of the gods. Both philosophies offered stability in an unpredictable world, emphasizing inner peace over political engagement. Meanwhile, trade and exploration expanded the Hellenistic world's horizons. Greek merchants navigated the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, exchanging goods and ideas with Arabia, India, and Africa. The Silk Road, still in its infancy, connected Hellenistic cities with Central Asian markets. Coins bearing Greek inscriptions circulated as far as Bactria and the Indus Valley, evidence of a globalized economy. Cities like Ai Khanum in modern Afghanistan embodied this fusion, Greek in design, Eastern in spirit, standing at the crossroads of two civilizations. Despite its achievements, the Hellenistic world was fragile. The successor kingdoms relied heavily on the charisma of their rulers and the loyalty of mercenary armies. Dynastic rivalries and external pressures, particularly from rising powers to the west, gradually eroded their stability. Rome, once a modest republic on the Italian peninsula, began to intervene in Greek affairs in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. Initially invited as an ally, it soon became an arbiter, and then a master. The Macedonian Wars, fought between 214 and 148 BCE, marked the systematic dismantling of Hellenistic independence. The Antigonid dynasty of Macedon fell first, followed by the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. By 30 BCE, With the death of Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic ruler, Egypt too came under Roman control. The Mediterranean world that had once spoken Greek now belonged politically to Rome, though culturally it remained deeply Hellenistic. Even under Roman rule, Greek language and thought continued to dominate intellectual life. Roman elites studied Greek literature and philosophy. Greek tutors educated their children. The Stoics shaped Roman ethics, while Greek art and architecture defined imperial aesthetics. In a sense, Greece had conquered its conquerors through culture. The synthesis of Greek reason and Roman order created the foundation of Western civilization. The Hellenistic age, though often overshadowed by the grandeur of classical Greece or the might of Rome, was the true seedbed of global civilization. It was an age of connection, inquiry, and transformation, when the boundaries between nations and ideas dissolved, and the pursuit of knowledge became a shared human endeavor. The world that emerged from Alexander's conquests was no longer merely Greek or Eastern, but something broader, a prototype of the interconnected world that would define history ever after. As Greece's political power faded, its intellectual and cultural influence endured. The next phase of this story would not take place in the city-states of the Aegean, but in the libraries of Alexandria, the academies of Athens, and the hearts of Roman thinkers who would inherit the Greek legacy. The civilization that began on the rocky shores of the Aegean had now become the intellectual heritage of humanity, a light that would continue to guide the ancient and modern worlds alike. The rise of Rome was neither sudden nor accidental. It was the outcome of centuries of gradual development, from a small community on the banks of the Tiber River into the commanding power of the Mediterranean world. Between the 8th and 1st centuries BCE, Rome transformed from a monarchy to a republic and finally into an empire. Each phase of this transformation reflected a balance between adaptation and ambition, shaped by geography, institutions, and relentless pragmatism. The civilization that would one day dominate Europe, North Africa, and the Near East began as a modest settlement surrounded by stronger and older cultures. The early Romans were part of the broader tapestry of Italic peoples who inhabited the Italian peninsula. Archaeological evidence indicates that by around 1000 BCE, villages dotted the hills of Latium. Their inhabitants engaged in agriculture, herding, and local trade. The Etruscans to the north, with their advanced metallurgy, urban planning, and religious practices, deeply influenced Roman society. Likewise, contact with Greek colonies in southern Italy and Sicily introduced the Romans to alphabetic writing, art, and new forms of governance. Rome, strategically located at the crossing of the Tiber, grew as a trading post between these civilizations. Tradition places the founding of Rome in 753 BCE, attributed to the semi-legendary figure of Romulus. While the early kings are shrouded in myth, archaeology confirms that by the 7th century BCE, Rome was already an organized community with temples, fortifications, and social hierarchy. The kingship likely represented a confederation of clans, balancing the authority of the monarch with the influence of leading families. The Etruscan period, particularly under kings such as Tarquinius Priscus and Tarquinius Superbus, saw the introduction of monumental architecture, the establishment of public rituals, and the expansion of the city's influence over neighboring tribes. By the late 6th century BCE, however, tensions between the monarchy and the aristocracy culminated in revolution. The expulsion of the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, in 509 BC marked the foundation of the Roman Republic. The shift was not a democratic revolution in the modern sense, but a reorganization of power among the elite. The new system balanced authority through magistracies, a senate composed of patrician elders, and popular assemblies that provided limited representation to the broader citizen body. This structure gave Rome remarkable stability and flexibility. 2 consuls, elected annually, shared executive power, while magistrates such as praetors, quaestors, and aediles managed administration, justice, and finance. In times of crisis, the Senate could appoint a dictator with absolute authority for 6 months. Over time, the plebeians, Rome's common citizens, demanded and secured greater rights through the conflict of the orders, achieving the codification of the 12 tables around 450 BCE, which made the law public and standardized. This process of negotiation between classes fostered civic cohesion and a sense of shared destiny. Rome's political ingenuity was matched by its military adaptability. The Roman army evolved from a tribal militia into a disciplined and organized force based on the legion. Service in the army became both a duty and a path to citizenship, binding the population to the state. Early conflicts with neighboring Latin and Italic tribes gradually extended Roman influence across central Italy. The decisive phase came during the Samnite Wars, 343 to 290 BCE, when Rome demonstrated not only military might, but also strategic patience. Victories were followed by pragmatic diplomacy. Conquered peoples were not destroyed but incorporated through alliances, colonies, and shared institutions. This inclusive strategy created a federation of Italian communities united by loyalty to Rome. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome dominated the Italian peninsula. Its next challenge came from abroad, the great maritime power of Carthage in North Africa. The Three Punic Wars, 264 to 146 BCE, defined the next century of Roman history and transformed the Republic into a Mediterranean empire. The First Punic War began over control of Sicily, lasting more than 2 decades. Rome, initially inexperienced at sea, adapted rapidly, building fleets and innovating naval tactics, such as the Corvus boarding bridge. Victory in 241 BCE brought Rome its first overseas province. The Second Punic War, led by the Carthaginian general Hannibal, tested Rome's endurance like no conflict before. Hannibal's crossing of the Alps and victories at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae stunned the ancient world. Yet Rome's resilience, its capacity to replace losses, sustain alliances, and adapt strategy, proved decisive. Under generals like Fabius Maximus and Scipio Africanus, Rome gradually regained control, culminating in Hannibal's defeat at Zama in 202 BC. The war left Carthage crippled and Rome ascendant across the western Mediterranean. Over the following decades, Roman expansion accelerated. Campaigns in Macedonia, Greece, and Asia Minor brought the Hellenistic world under Roman influence. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Roman legions had reached Spain, North Africa, and the eastern Mediterranean. Each conquest brought new wealth, slaves, and resources, but also new strains on the republican system. The influx of riches widened social inequality, and the reliance on slave labor displaced small farmers, eroding the traditional citizen base that had sustained the republic's army and values. Efforts to reform the system met fierce resistance. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, attempted to redistribute land and address the grievances of the poor in the late 2nd century BCE. Both were killed, setting a precedent for political violence. The following century was marked by instability and civil conflict as powerful generals exploited the loyalty of their troops for personal gain. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Julius Caesar turned the Republic's institutions into instruments of factional power. The transition from Republic to Empire was gradual but inevitable. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BCE and his subsequent dictatorship marked the point of no return. His assassination in 44 BCE, intended to restore the old order, only deepened the crisis. After years of civil war, Octavian, later Augustus, emerged victorious, establishing the Principate in 27 BC. The Republic's forms remained, but real power lay with the emperor. The Senate continued to meet, magistrates continued to serve, but all authority flowed from one center. Under Augustus, Rome entered its golden age, a period of stability, prosperity, and cultural achievement known as the Pax Romana. The empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Roads, aqueducts, and administrative systems integrated this vast territory into a coherent whole. Latin became the language of law and governance, while Greek remained the medium of philosophy and science. The Roman legal system, emphasizing rationality and universality, became one of the most enduring legacies of antiquity. The empire's power rested not only on force, but on organization. Provincial governors maintained order and collected taxes, while Roman citizenship gradually extended to provincial elites. This inclusiveness created loyalty and facilitated assimilation. Cities modeled on Rome, with forums, baths, and theaters, appeared across Europe and the Near East, spreading a shared urban culture. Trade networks connected distant regions, moving grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, and silk from Asia. Culturally, the Roman world absorbed and reinterpreted Greek achievements. Roman architects perfected the arch and the dome, building monumental structures such as the Colosseum and the Pantheon. Writers like Virgil, Horace, and Livy celebrated Rome's destiny and moral ideals. Stoicism found new expression in thinkers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, who framed virtue as service to the state and the human community. Yet the empire's very success carried the seeds of its challenges. Maintaining such vast territories demanded immense resources and constant vigilance. Border conflicts with Germanic tribes and Parthians strained the legions. Economic disparities persisted, and political succession remained uncertain, often leading to intrigue and instability. Still, for nearly 2 centuries after Augustus, Rome maintained a level of order and prosperity unmatched in the ancient world. By integrating diverse peoples under a common system of law, culture, and infrastructure, Rome achieved what earlier empires had only envisioned: a world governed by a single political and cultural framework. The Mediterranean became, in the Roman phrase, mare nostrum, our sea. The Roman Empire thus stood as both the culmination of ancient statecraft and the foundation of Western civilization. As the story of Rome advanced beyond its golden age, new forces, social, spiritual, and external, would begin to challenge its unity. The coming centuries would witness transformation rather than collapse, the evolution of the ancient world into something new, a bridge toward the medieval and modern ages that would inherit both its achievements and its lessons. The centuries that followed the height of the Pax Romana marked a subtle but undeniable transformation of the Roman world. What had once been a realm of relentless expansion and confidence began to reveal internal strains. The empire's size, which had once been a source of strength, now posed logistical and administrative challenges. Communication between distant provinces became slower, taxation heavier, and military commitments unending. Yet Rome's decline was not a sudden collapse, but a long process of adjustment, resilience, and eventual transformation that unfolded over centuries. By the 3rd century CE, the empire entered a phase historians later termed the crisis of the 3rd century. It was a time of rapid succession of emperors, economic instability, and constant warfare. Between 235 and 284 CE, more than 24 emperors rose and fell, many meeting violent ends. The frontiers were under pressure from Germanic tribes in the north and Sasanian Persians in the east. Internally, inflation eroded the value of currency, while plague reduced populations and labor supplies. The once solid political system of the Principate, built on the illusion of republican institutions under imperial control, fractured under the weight of reality. Yet, amidst the turmoil, Rome demonstrated its remarkable capacity for adaptation. The reforms of Emperor Diocletian in the late 3rd century were a deliberate attempt to restore stability through structure. He reorganized the empire into smaller administrative units, increasing efficiency and control. The imperial office was transformed into an openly autocratic position, divinely sanctioned and supported by a vast bureaucracy. To ensure stability, Diocletian introduced the Tetrarchy, rule by 4 emperors, intended to divide responsibilities and prevent usurpation. While the system did not survive long, it reflected the empire's capacity for pragmatic reform. Economic reforms attempted to curb inflation through edicts on prices and labor obligations. Socially, the rigidification of professions began. Sons were expected to follow their fathers' trades, binding generations to their economic roles. This was not oppression by design, but an effort to maintain continuity in a society under immense pressure. At the same time, the Roman army was restructured, emphasizing mobile defense and frontier fortifications rather than aggressive conquest. The empire's priorities had shifted from expansion to preservation. A profound transformation, however, was underway not just in governance, but in belief. In the early 4th century, Emperor Constantine emerged as the dominant ruler after a series of civil wars. His reign marked one of the most consequential turning points in world history, the adoption of Christianity as a favored faith within the empire. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE granted religious tolerance, ending centuries of sporadic persecution. Over time, Christianity evolved from a minority movement into a unifying cultural force, offering spiritual coherence to an empire increasingly fragmented by politics and class. Constantine's decision to found a new capital in 330 CE, Constantinople, built on the site of ancient Byzantium, symbolized both continuity and change. Strategically located between Europe and Asia, it embodied Rome's shift toward the eastern Mediterranean, where commerce and population remained strong. The city's walls, forums, and churches projected imperial power in a new cultural language, one blending Roman administration with Greek intellect and Christian faith. The creation of Constantinople effectively divided the empire into two spheres, Latin-speaking in the west, Greek-speaking in the east. Over the 4th and 5th centuries, the Western Roman Empire faced growing external pressures. Germanic migrations, spurred by climate shifts and the advance of the Huns from Central Asia, pushed new groups into Roman territories. These were not mere invasions, but complex movements of peoples seeking stability and land. Initially, Rome managed these pressures through diplomacy and settlement treaties, allowing federated tribes to serve as defenders of the frontiers. However, as resources dwindled and central authority weakened, these arrangements often turned into conflicts. The sack of Rome by the Visigoths under Alaric in 410 CE shocked the ancient world but did not end it. The empire still functioned, its bureaucracy and institutions resilient. Yet, by the mid-5th century, the western half had become a patchwork of semi-autonomous kingdoms under nominal Roman oversight. The deposition of the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476 CE, by the Germanic general Odoacer, symbolized the end of imperial rule in the West, but not the end of Roman civilization. The Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, continued for nearly 1,000 more years, preserving much of Rome's intellectual, legal, and administrative heritage. In the East, the Byzantine Empire, as it would later be called, carried forward the Roman legacy under new forms. Greek replaced Latin as the language of administration, but Roman law, imperial ceremony, and urban life persisted. The Emperor Justinian I, ruling in the 6th century, sought to restore Roman greatness. His codification of Roman law, known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, became one of the most influential legal systems in world history, forming the foundation for European jurisprudence centuries later. His general Belisarius briefly reconquered parts of Italy and North Africa, and the construction of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople demonstrated the enduring Roman genius for architecture and symbolism. While the West fragmented into kingdoms such as the Visigothic, Ostrogothic, and Frankish realms, the idea of Rome remained a unifying reference point. Roman roads, cities, and administrative boundaries continued to shape medieval Europe. The Latin language evolved into the Romance tongues, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, ensuring that Rome's cultural DNA survived. The Christian Church, centered in Rome and Constantinople, preserved literacy, law, and moral philosophy, becoming the institution through which Rome's intellectual legacy endured the chaos of the early Middle Ages. Historians once described the period after the fall of Rome as a dark age, but modern research has revealed continuity rather than abrupt loss. Roman agricultural methods, engineering, and local governance persisted under new rulers. Even the concept of empire itself, the idea of a universal authority binding diverse peoples, remained powerful. In 800 CE, when Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope, it was not a new creation but an echo of an ancient ideal that never truly vanished. From a broader perspective, the fall of Rome was less a catastrophe than a transformation of systems. The centralized, urban, and bureaucratic world of antiquity evolved into the localized, agrarian, and feudal structures of medieval Europe. Roman citizenship gave way to Christian identity. The imperial army was replaced by regional loyalties, but the idea of law, order, and cultural continuity persisted. Through Byzantine scholarship, Islamic preservation of Greek texts, and Latin monastic learning, the intellectual spirit of Rome became the seedbed for the Renaissance a millennium later. By the time Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the Roman Empire, in one form or another, had lasted for over 2,000 years. It had begun as a small city-state on the Tiber, risen to command continents, adapted to crisis, and transformed into a spiritual and cultural legacy that outlived its political form. The story of Rome is thus not a tale of rise and fall, but of endurance and reinvention. Its roads, laws, languages, and ideas still shape the world. The notion of a republic guided by civic duty, an empire bound by law, and a civilization defined by infrastructure and learning all stem from this ancient foundation. As history advanced into the modern era, the Roman experience remained a reference point for governance, architecture, and philosophy. Even the names of modern institutions, Senate, Forum, Citizen, carry echoes of Latin roots. The transformation of Rome into Byzantium, and later into the idea of Europe itself, closes the ancient narrative but opens another, the inheritance of the classical world by new civilizations. The continuity of knowledge, the preservation of legal thought, and the persistence of organized governance form the bridge between antiquity and modernity. Rome did not end. It evolved, leaving behind a blueprint for power and order that still informs how societies understand themselves today. The transformation of the Roman world into the Byzantine Empire represents one of the most remarkable continuities in human history. What began as the eastern half of a vast imperial system evolved into a distinct civilization that fused Roman governance, Greek intellect, and Christian faith. Over 1,000 years, Byzantium carried the memory of Rome into a new age, serving as both guardian and transmitter of classical and early Christian heritage. Its history, though often overshadowed by the grandeur of ancient Rome, reveals the endurance of empire through adaptation, faith, and cultural synthesis. In the 4th century CE, when Constantine founded Constantinople, he established not merely a new capital, but a new vision of Rome, one more suited to the changing realities of the late antique world. The city's location on the Bosporus provided natural defense and control over key trade routes between Europe and Asia. Its walls, later expanded by Emperor Theodosius II, were masterpieces of military engineering that would protect the city for nearly a millennium. Within its fortifications rose a city of marble forums, basilicas, and palaces, where Roman law, Greek learning, and Christian theology intertwined. The early Byzantine Empire inherited the administrative complexity of the late Roman state. The emperor remained the supreme authority, governing through an elaborate bureaucracy that collected taxes, managed provinces, and oversaw justice. Latin continued as the language of officialdom until the 7th century, when Greek gradually replaced it as the empire's lingua franca. The shift was not only linguistic, but cultural. The Byzantine world became the heir to Hellenistic intellectual traditions while maintaining Roman institutions of governance and law. Religion became the central pillar of Byzantine identity. The conversion of Constantine had set in motion the Christianization of the empire, but it was under Theodosius I in the late 4th century that Christianity became the state religion. Pagan temples were closed, and church councils were convened to define orthodoxy. Theological debate, often intense and politically charged, shaped the empire's intellectual life. The great ecumenical councils, Nicaea, Chalcedon, and others, sought to articulate the nature of Christ and the Trinity, establishing doctrines that continue to define Christian theology today. Byzantine emperors saw themselves as both political and spiritual leaders, protectors of the faith and guardians of divine order. The concept of Caesaropapism, the unity of temporal and spiritual authority, defined the Byzantine state. Yet the relationship between emperor and church was not always harmonious. Controversies such as the iconoclast movement in the 8th and 9th centuries, which opposed the veneration of religious images, divided society, and revealed the tension between faith and authority. Ultimately, the restoration of icons under Empress Theodora reaffirmed the Byzantine synthesis of art, devotion, and theology. Culturally, Byzantium preserved and expanded upon the intellectual achievements of the classical world. Its scholars copied, commented upon, and transmitted the works of Homer, Plato, Aristotle, and Galen. Monasteries became centers of learning and preservation, ensuring the survival of texts that would later fuel the Renaissance in Western Europe. Byzantine art and architecture reached heights of refinement unmatched in the medieval world. The construction of the Hagia Sophia under Emperor Justinian I in the 6th century symbolized the empire's spiritual and aesthetic ideals, its vast dome seeming to float above a sea of light, a vision of divine order expressed through engineering and geometry. Justinian's reign represented the high point of Byzantine ambition. Between 527 and 565 CE, he sought to restore the lost western provinces to imperial control. His general Belisarius reconquered North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain, temporarily reuniting the Mediterranean under a single rule. More enduring than his conquests, however, was his codification of Roman law. The Corpus Juris Civilis, a systematic compilation of centuries of legal thought, became the foundation of civil law in Europe and a testament to the empire's intellectual rigor. Justinian also undertook massive urban and architectural renewal, reinforcing Constantinople as the political and spiritual center of the Christian world. Yet Byzantium was not immune to the forces of change. After Justinian's death, the empire faced renewed pressures on multiple fronts. The Lombards invaded Italy, the Persians threatened from the east, and the rise of Islam in the 7th century introduced a new and formidable power. Within a few decades, Muslim armies had conquered Syria, Egypt, and North Africa, territories that had long been vital to the Roman world. The Byzantine Empire, though reduced in size, survived through resilience and strategic adaptation. The introduction of the theme system, which combined military and administrative control within provinces, allowed for flexible defense and local governance. The 9th and 10th centuries marked a period of recovery and cultural flowering, often called the Macedonian Renaissance. Under emperors such as Basil I and Constantine VII, the empire revived its economy, expanded its borders, and produced significant works of art, theology, and historiography. Constantinople became a beacon of wealth and learning, its marketplaces filled with goods from across Europe and Asia. Byzantine diplomacy, renowned for its subtlety, maintained balance among neighboring powers through treaties, marriages, and strategic alliances. Art and theology continued to evolve in parallel. Byzantine mosaics, icons, and manuscripts embodied a vision of the sacred as eternal and transcendent. Gold backgrounds, elongated figures, and serene expressions sought not realism but spiritual truth. These artistic forms influenced Orthodox Christian cultures from the Balkans to Russia, spreading a distinct Byzantine aesthetic and theology that emphasized divine mystery and the continuity of tradition. By the 11th century, internal divisions and external pressures once again tested the empire's strength. The Great Schism of 1054 formally divided the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, a separation rooted in centuries of cultural and doctrinal divergence. The Seljuk Turks' victory at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 further weakened Byzantine control over Anatolia, the empire's economic heartland. Seeking assistance, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos appealed to the West, an appeal that helped spark the First Crusade. Initially, the Crusades provided temporary relief and even opportunity. Byzantine emperors managed to recover some territories, and Constantinople flourished as a crossroads of commerce between Europe and Asia. But the Fourth Crusade in 1204 brought catastrophe. Western crusaders, diverted by political intrigue, sacked Constantinople, looting its treasures and fracturing the empire. Although the Byzantines eventually recaptured their capital in 1261, the empire never regained its former strength. The final centuries of Byzantium were marked by decline tempered by cultural brilliance. Scholars such as Gemistos Plethon and Anna Komnene continued to write and teach, preserving Greek philosophy and history for future generations. Art and architecture remained vibrant, and Orthodox Christianity spread northward, finding new centers in Russia and the Balkans. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, under Sultan Mehmed II, marked the end of the Byzantine state, but not of its legacy. The city's libraries, scholars, and traditions fueled the European Renaissance, while the Orthodox Church continued as the spiritual descendant of the Byzantine world. The Byzantine Empire thus served as a bridge between antiquity and modernity, the living continuation of the Roman state in Christian form. It transmitted classical knowledge to the Islamic world and later to the West, maintained the legal and administrative foundations of empire, and forged a cultural identity that would influence Eastern Europe and beyond. Where the Roman Republic had embodied civic virtue and expansion, Byzantium represented endurance, faith, and intellect. The fall of Constantinople did not end the story of Rome. It merely transformed it once again. The Ottomans adopted many Byzantine institutions, while the legacy of imperial Christian civilization spread across Slavic lands and into Renaissance Europe. The idea of Rome, as law, empire, and universal order, survived in both East and West. Byzantium's millennium of endurance ensured that the wisdom of antiquity would not be lost, but reborn in new forms across the ages to come. Thus, the torch passed from the ancient to the medieval and modern worlds. From the Tiber to the Bosporus, from marble temples to domed cathedrals, the Roman idea of civilization, ordered, enduring, and learned, continued to illuminate the course of human history. The enduring legacy of Greece and Rome, reshaped, transmitted, and renewed through Byzantium, became the cornerstone of Western civilization. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the last surviving fragment of the ancient world was extinguished politically, yet its intellectual and cultural spirit dispersed across Europe, igniting a profound transformation known as the Renaissance. This era did not simply rediscover antiquity, it reinterpreted it. Through art, philosophy, and science, the ideals of classical balance, inquiry, and human potential were reborn in a new age that bridged the medieval and modern worlds. The fall of Constantinople itself became a conduit of transmission. Byzantine scholars, fleeing westward with ancient manuscripts, brought Greek philosophy, science, and literature to cities such as Venice, Florence, and Rome. They reintroduced Europe to the full corpus of Aristotle and Plato, to Euclid's geometry, and to Ptolemy's cosmology. Humanist scholars such as Petrarch and Boccaccio, already looking back to Rome for moral and linguistic models, now had direct access to original Greek sources. In Florence, figures like Marsilio Ficino translated and taught Platonic philosophy, weaving it into Christian humanism, the belief that reason and faith could coexist in the pursuit of truth. The printing press, invented in the mid-15th century, accelerated this intellectual revival. Ancient texts, once confined to monastic libraries, could now circulate widely. The works of Cicero, Virgil, and Livy shaped a new educational curriculum, the Studia Humanitatis, emphasizing grammar, rhetoric, and moral philosophy. The humanists saw in the ancients not distant idols, but examples of how human intellect could shape a just and ordered society. Their admiration was practical and civic, rooted in the belief that knowledge ennobled the individual and improved governance. Art mirrored this intellectual reawakening. The realism and proportion studied in Greek sculpture and Roman frescoes reappeared in the works of Renaissance masters. Artists such as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael treated the human body not as a mere vessel of sin, as in medieval art, but as a reflection of divine order. Mathematical perspective, anatomical precision, and harmony of form were revived as expressions of universal truth, the same ideals once pursued in the temples and academies of Athens. Architecture, too, returned to classical symmetry. Columns, domes, and arches once again defined civic spaces. In these forms, the Renaissance proclaimed continuity with the ancient idea that beauty and reason were inseparable. In politics, the echoes of Rome guided the birth of modern statecraft. Thinkers such as Niccolò Machiavelli studied Livy's history of Rome to understand the mechanisms of power and stability. His reflections on civic virtue and republican resilience drew directly from the Roman experience. Likewise, the legal traditions codified by Justinian resurfaced in European law codes, shaping the foundations of modern jurisprudence. Latin remained the universal language of scholarship and diplomacy, sustaining the intellectual unity that Rome had once achieved through empire. Religion, too, absorbed the impact of classical revival. The Catholic Church, though often wary of pagan philosophy, adopted humanist principles in education and theology. The synthesis of faith and reason, a legacy of Aristotle transmitted through Byzantium and scholasticism, reached new maturity in the works of Thomas Aquinas and Erasmus of Rotterdam. Yet this revival also sowed the seeds of questioning. The critical spirit that humanism encouraged led eventually to the Reformation, as scholars and theologians began to challenge the authority of tradition in pursuit of personal understanding and moral reform. The expansion of knowledge that followed was not limited to Europe. The voyages of discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries reflected a new confidence in human agency, a belief, rooted in Greek rationalism and Roman organization, that the world could be measured, mapped, and understood. The same mathematical precision that defined Renaissance art guided navigation and astronomy. When Copernicus proposed a heliocentric universe, he invoked not only observation, but the ancient idea of a cosmos governed by rational order. The scientific revolution that followed extended the Greek tradition of inquiry and the Roman tradition of practical application. Even in governance and identity, the memory of classical civilization persisted. The republican ideals of Greece and Rome inspired new political thought. In Florence and Venice, citizens spoke of liberty and civic duty in terms borrowed from antiquity. Centuries later, during the Enlightenment, philosophers such as Montesquieu and Rousseau would again look to Rome for models of constitutional balance. The American founders adopted Roman symbols and Latin mottos, framing their republic as the heir of ancient virtue. Thus, through law, architecture, and language, the legacy of the classical world became the blueprint for the modern age. At the same time, the Orthodox East continued to cultivate its own inheritance of Greek and Roman wisdom. In the Slavic world, the Byzantine model of sacred kingship and liturgical art endured. Russian and Balkan monasteries preserved the Greek Fathers and Byzantine chronicles, while the Church of Hagia Sophia, now under Ottoman rule, remained a symbol of continuity. The Ottomans themselves adopted many aspects of Byzantine administration and court ceremony, demonstrating once again how empires transform rather than vanish. The idea of universal order, so central to Roman and Byzantine governance, persisted within the Islamic Caliphate and later the Ottoman Sultanate, binding new cultures into the lineage of the ancient Mediterranean world. Across both East and West, the study of antiquity continued to shape human thought. The 17th and 18th centuries saw the systematic recovery of archaeological evidence, coins, inscriptions, ruins. Scholars began to reconstruct not just the texts but the material reality of the ancient world. Pompeii and Herculaneum, rediscovered under volcanic ash, revealed the daily life of Rome with astonishing clarity. Museums and universities institutionalized the study of classics, ensuring that the legacy of Greece and Rome remained at the center of education. In modern times, the influence of the classical world extends far beyond academia. Democratic ideals, codified law, urban planning, and the very notion of citizenship bear the imprint of ancient models. Every modern parliament, courthouse, and university built in neoclassical style stands as a visible reminder of that inheritance. Even the vocabulary of science and politics, words like atom, republic, senate, and democracy, are linguistic fossils from the ancient past. The legacy of ancient civilization thus lies not in monuments alone, but in principles, in the conviction that order arises from reason, that justice depends on law, and that knowledge is the foundation of human progress. These ideals have been tested, reinterpreted, and sometimes forgotten, yet they continue to inform the world's moral and political frameworks. Through the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and into the present age, humanity has remained in dialogue with its ancient past. Each generation rediscovers Greece and Rome, not as relics, but as mirrors, reflecting both the achievements and the ambitions of civilization itself. The continuity from the Aegean villages to the marble forums, from the libraries of Byzantium to the academies of Florence, reveals a single enduring story. That knowledge, once kindled, can survive the fall of empires and the passage of centuries. Thus, the history of civilization comes full circle. From the myths of the Aegean to the reason of Athens, from the legions of Rome to the domes of Byzantium, and from the scholars of Constantinople to the thinkers of the modern age, the thread of human inquiry remains unbroken. What began in stone and bronze now endures in ideas, the true monuments of civilization. Through archaeology and written record, their story continues to teach us how civilization began, how it endured, and how its lessons still shape the world we build today.